Hello, and welcome to the Hard Hats and Hot Topics podcast brought to you by Calford Seedon. Today we're discussing one of the most significant changes to energy regulation, Heat Networks Technical Assurance Scheme. I'm Dr Chris Marien from Calford Seedon. I'm Head of MEP and Sustainability. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Peter Mills from Bosch Thermotechnik and Daniel Perager, Head of Heat, Energy and Water at Notting Hill Genesis. Welcome, gentlemen.
Right.
Peter, perhaps you could kick us off by giving an overview to what
Sure.
HNTAS is.
No, thanks for inviting us today. HNTAS is part of a suite of regulations that have been brought in by government for the heat network sector. Just to go back a little bit to explain where all this has come from. Back in around 2018, government asked the Competitions Markets Authority to look into the entire heat network industry to see what was going on because there were some complaints from consumers and the like. And to cut a long story short, they came back to government and said essentially that they should regulate the industry so that it's like other utilities because effectively, heat networks are a natural monopoly, so they didn't need some regulation. But unusually for the CMA, they also came back and said there was actually some technical issues that they discovered. And they urged the industry at that point to look into trying to rectify that sort of thing. Fast forward to 2023, and we had the Energy Act. And the Energy Act had something in it called the Heat Network Market Framework. And that essentially brought in three new regulations for the industry. So HNTAS or the Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme, is just one of those regulations. We got consumer protection, and there's also heat network zoning coming in at the same time. So, it's a really significant change for the industry, for sure. It's going to be, a complete change to how we work and how we do things. So HNTAS itself was developed or started to be developed back in 2024. So if you're familiar with CIBSE CP1, which has been the main guidance document really for heat networks for some time, since 2015. What HNTAS has essentially done is taken all of the clauses from CP1 and looked to see how they could be verified and how you could validate them on site and that type of thing. And so it started with working groups back in 2024. I was involved with a couple of the working groups, the one for the Energy Centre and the one for the consumer heat system. Now, there's a lot of new language here that we're going to have to get used to because that essentially means the HIU or the heat interface unit part of the system. We started, it really was a complex process, really. Lots of hours working through, almost day-long meetings in some cases that we went through there. And it's gradually built from there to where we are today, really, which is the rest of what we're going to talk about, I think, in a minute.
Okay, so from a practical level of a kind of consumer, is it kind of bringing heat networks into the same realms as they have for gas and electricity? So they've got a route for complaints and compensation,
Absolutely.
Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of that sits within the consumer regulation part. That's going to be overseen by Ofgem. There's been several rounds of consultation on that already. Largely, although Dan might be able to come on this, but largely I think it's been relatively uncontroversial and it's relatively on track to come through. But the first kind of action for that will be that it will mean that every single heat network in the UK will have to register with Ofgem. And we think there's something between 12,000, 14,000 heat networks, something like that, in the UK that are existing. But
so maybe quickly before we come to Daniel, maybe quickly touch on that, because there is the existing heat networks, heat metering and billing regulations that required everyone to kind of register their heat network. So is there a slight change in requirements there?
Definitely a change. The heat network metering and billing regulations came in 2014. I think it was one of those regulations that just didn't seem to quite get the take-up that you'd expect, really. I think a lot of people didn't understand that they had to register their networks. There was a lot of controversy in the early stages around the technical compliance of that. There was a tool that was going to be developed, and so it kind of fell a bit flat. And although, it still remains as a regulation at the moment, what we do know is that that will actually be rescinded. It will go, and it will be replaced by a new regulation known as the metering and monitoring standard. Now, exactly when that happens, I is my understanding of it, it will be when Heat Network Technical Assurance Scheme actually comes into effect, I believe. At that point, there'll be that changeover.
Okay. And Dan, from your perspective as a registered provider, are you welcoming this kind of regulation now?
Yeah, so as a social housing providers crave regulation. If you regulate something, we will do it, and that's always been the case for social housing. But the heat network regulation specifically, it's something the industry's needed for a long time. The upcoming regulation from the 27th of January for the heat network authorisation is going to set out specific standards for consumer protection. On top of that, part of that was introducing the CAB to be an advocacy for individual customers, because it's always been something that's been lacking. As Pete said, we've had a monopoly for so long, and there's nothing we can really do about that. You can't connect another boiler to a heat network and supply heat to an individual dwelling. You need that. The customers have always needed that extra assurance. Who do we go to? Who can we complain to? Who can we bring up our specific complaints to? Because there's lots of heat network operators out there that are very ambiguous of how they set things like variable tariffs, what's included in their standing charge. Obviously, not for NHG, because we're a social housing provider. We need to do what's right for our residents and consumers. And we've got the housing regulator on top of Ofgem. And there's lots of other things that we need to comply to as a housing provider that's helped us along the way to be a good heating provider.
Okay, so who else is this going to affect? Really, is it just going to be at the kind of top end, such as the providers and network operators, or does this really filter down through all the contractors, etc.? Because to work on local infrastructure, if you're an electricity provider or on the gas network, you have to be a registered supplier or gone through that training. Is there going to be any kind of similar accreditation schemes? Or because at the moment, a plumber can effectively
so there's talk of TS1, isn't there? Where you'll have to be able to demonstrate competency to be able to work on the specific equipment. The finer detail of that, I think, is yet to be worked out. There's peer reviews ongoing for what that looks like. So I won't want to comment too much until we've seen the finer detail. I know Pete might have some more views on that because he might be a bit more involved in the detail.
Yeah, I think, I was on the Technical Standards Committee, but I think ultimately DESNZ would love to have a competency scheme attached to heat networks. There's no question about it. But I think the gap, unfortunately, from where we are today to where that is a huge one. When you said who will it affect, essentially it'll affect everybody who's involved in the heat network industry at the moment, from the installer right up to the developer. It's going to affect every single person and in some way. I think they're all. What's interesting, I guess, really, is there's a new class of persons that will be involved in the whole process of heat networks, and that is the assessor, these independent assessors. I think right from the outset of HNTAS, there's been a concern about where these people are going to come from, because unfortunately the industry's not awash with skills and knowledge out there. And so that's always been a concern. There's been quite a bit of information that's actually come through this week with the consultation, or the start of the consultation on HNTAS. There's a bit more information about what level these assessors are going to actually have to be, and it's essentially been split up into 3 different levels. So there seems to be quite a fairly mundane low level class, if you like, in there that is going to be dealing with the day-to-day stuff, verifying evidence, etc., on site and with the designers and the like. And then there's a review process of that, so there'll be another kind of class of people in the middle, and then ultimately there's a kind of decision maker at the top that will actually be a chartered engineer status. So that kind of void of personnel, if you like, in the industry has somehow got to be filled. But at the same time, big opportunity for people, really, because it's a completely new area.
So if further in the documents, there is a matrix of how you attain those levels. So lots of those levels could be attained by people already in the industry. It's just that, there's got to be an understanding in the industry of this is a thing that's coming into effect. When I speak to my contractors, traditionally the traditional social housing contracts of the South East, lots of them didn't really have this on their radar. How is HNTAS going to affect us? Did any of them apply to the consultation? Did they reply? Were they on a peer review board? No, because they think it's the client's responsibility or the operator's responsibility, when lots and lots of clients are going to be asking contractors to do this for them, or at least report on their behalf. How are you demonstrated competency? What have I got to do to comply? What equipment have I got to fix? What are the KPIs? And as a client, we bring our contractors along for the ride on that. And luckily for us, I'd like to think we're at the forefront of this. But I know lots and lots of my peers are nowhere near that. So there's lots of contractors out there that do this for social housing that have got absolutely no idea what's going to happen, how they're going to do it, what competency they need, how much it's going to cost. There's a lot of lack of understanding, and it's just us as an industry have got to raise the awareness for the whole industry to understand this is really important, and everyone's got to buy into it, because the old heat net with the meter and billing regulations really, I'll be frank, got ignored because no one understood they needed to do it. OPSS had absolutely no teeth. They didn't do anything when anyone reported something was non-compliant. And all the contractors went round saying, they did the value for money report saying, no, we don't have to do that. And no one did anything. And I really don't want this to be the same scenario. I don't think it'll ever will be, because Ofgem have got teeth and everyone needs to be aware of that.
Maybe that's the interesting bit to pick up on then, because we're so used to regulations affecting new builds and everything that we're doing from now. However, a big part of this is the existing networks, and we know the vast majority of heat networks that are out there now and have been in operation for maybe 40, 50 years, they're being brought into this regulations as well. Is that correct?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's, not all regulations go back retrospectively, but this one is. But I think, that's a kind of recognition of how important it is to get all of these heat networks up and running. You can't just leave consumers at the end of a system that's not giving good outcomes from, essentially. Why should somebody be suffering to paying higher bills and having, outages and that type of thing? So, it's understandable it's got to go backwards, but it's a big thing. And I mean, as Dan was saying, there's such poor understanding about what's coming out there. I mean, this week I've been up and down the country talking to people about this topic all week, but and there's the awareness of it is really poor, unfortunately, at the minute. But the existing pathway to go through HNTAS is interesting in itself, really. It splits up into two different pathways. There's one for if you would have had to fit customer level meters, which is typically heat networks that have been built after 2015. And there's another different route for ones that would have been before that, where it would have been perhaps difficult to fit customer level meters. But ultimately, where there may be a couple of extra years in the harder to do route, as it were, ultimately all consumers at some point are going to have a meter, which is, it's got to be the goal really here. But that's going to be quite a step up for a lot of heat network operators, for sure.
Yeah, it's a massive challenge. I've got 83 what we call unmetered heat networks. We traditionally sell heat in service charge, and lots of other housing providers have got many more unmetered systems than Notting Hill Genesis. And when we do fit meters in their dwelling, there's a fundamental change. All of a sudden, we've got a bill for consumption. That's a massive change for a housing provider, because it used to be quite simple. It was gas divided by number of dwellings or divided by square metre, apportioned to service charge. If you leave that heat in the service charge, you've then got to reconcile every single metre and add it to the service charge. You've got to bring the residents along with the journey, because what they've been used to paying a fixed charge of £10 a week or a month for heating, all of a sudden they're now paying for what they use. And traditionally these are in care and support settings. They're in tenures where people are vulnerable. If you're providing now a heat bill or a separate line that says heat and it's based on what they've actually used and their bills all of a sudden shoot up, that's a really difficult conversation to have with somebody, especially when you're supposed to be protecting your vulnerable tenants. It's actually, we're going to charge you more because you consume lots of heat. We've got to do it, but the comms to be able to do that social, respectfully and comply to our social agenda. It's going to be really difficult.
Do you see that kind of transparency of data and information as a key benefit to kind of educating residents in terms of what they're using and trying to, because they're going to be part of this kind of efficiency, obtaining efficiencies within heat networks?
So what we've just done a retrofit. We've done a complete refurbishment of a heat network. It wasn't metered. Unfortunately, it was beyond economic optimization, so we had to completely replace that network. So lots of the residents already fed back to us that actually we want to pay for consumption, because I don't really use my heat. I use hot water, but then there's other residents that they quite happily leave their room thermostat on, and when they're too hot, they open the windows. So what we've noticed is actually our gas bills have decreased. The heat network is more efficient anyway, but people have changed their behaviour because they can see the consumption. Actually, do I need the heating to be on? And I'll turn it off instead of opening my window. So we've brought the residents along. We've educated them. There's a lot of education, lots of comms pieces when it comes to this. You can't have too much comms. You can't have too much interaction when you're fundamentally making a change this big to things like unmetered networks, because it is a massive change. And it's really underestimated from a technical perspective. It's great. Engineers are like, yeah, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. So you forget about the person at the end, because that's what we're doing this for, and we need to bring them along to the journey.
Yes, I guess that's it, because regulation is always about, consumer protection and improving performance for them. So as the consumers, what do you think they'll see from these new regulations? Do you think they'll welcome it, or like anything, they just kind of doesn't affect their day-to-day?
Yeah, I mean, the focus seems to be, or what DESNZ want, owners and operators of existing heat networks to focus on initially is getting your reliability up. Yeah. And I think that has been a big problem on some networks. People are pretty fed up if they've got a major outage. Just not used to that these days, are we? Let's face it. We're used to robust systems. So I think if it's done as it should be, and there is this initial focus, getting your O&M practices correct, your water treatment, and all the stuff that goes with that, all of your records and things up, then I think there's hopefully a bit more. Confidence in the system that it's going to deliver what it can do, and then ultimately, as time goes past, and all these things cost money to do, but as hopefully investment comes into to the networks, then you start to improve your performance, and it's that point really where you start to see their bills perhaps come under control, as it were, and see some advantages from that. So,
okay, then. Maybe we should start to touch on this kind of performance element, and we've mentioned there's KPIs and there's also kind of milestones and technical requirements built in. So maybe we can talk about some of them. What are the KPIs that operators are going to be expected to deliver?
Yeah, I mean, for existing networks, there's quite a lot of KPIs. They're broadly kind of split out into ones that would affect reliability and those that would affect performance. Really, you could perhaps group them into those, but there's a number of different topics and areas where they're looking at. In terms of performance, for a long time we've had this target within CIBSE CP1 that was 100 watts per dwelling for new build. That's pretty hard to achieve at times, particularly for older networks. So what we see in the pathway for existing is that there's various milestones. And at the earlier milestones, like the end of milestone 2, etc., you're looking for a target of around 400 watts per dwelling. Yeah. But then ultimately, as you're trying to improve the network, improve the performance, the target is 200 watts per dwelling. Still quite demanding, probably, for some networks. And
yeah, so 200 watts per dwelling is achievable. So we've done it. NHG have had lots of optimization studies and lots of work alongside our partners and funded by DESNZ with HNTAS money. So we have achieved 200 watts on multiple sites, but they tend to be sites that we call metered already, so they're post-2015. Pre-2015 systems are going to be very, very difficult to achieve 200 watts dwelling without either significant investment or complete replacements. And then when you talk about complete replacements, you're also getting into the realms of actually, is this now commercially viable even to leave as a communal heating system? So, we've done some very high level cost analysis for a new heat network in a care and support setting. Leaving it with residents still there and working around them, and all that entails, costs you about £40,000 a unit. It's gone past the realms of actually it's cheaper to fit night storage heaters and individual cylinders and just remove the communal heating altogether. It's something that the industry's got to consider. Actually, there's lots of regulation. It's brilliant. We want to bring everyone along for a ride, but are we pushing communal heating out of the physical realms for some buildings? Because I think existing dwellings, we are realistically going to have to look at moving away from communal heat.
I think you're right, Dan. If there's not some significant funding there available, and I think that's the big question really at the minute. I think we've seen the warm homes plan, etc., come out this week. They've mentioned in there about how they intend to do funding for heat networks going forward with the Green Heat Network Fund and HNTAS, etc. But there definitely was a number of comments in there that said they're still considering this area and wondering what they do need to fund and where that would be best spent really. But I think there's going to be a gap for those type of networks, definitely, if there's not something to bridge it.
Do you see this as a kind of more London-centric problem? Because the vast majority of heat networks tend to be in London, and I think looking at the GLA's latest data on from 2003, I think it's the latest. 9 out of 10 new dwellings will be connected to a heat network. I'm sure if you go out to other counties, etc., it's not going to be that kind.
I don't think it is. I think there's more of an issue in London just because we've got a greater number of networks. But there's lots and lots of heat networks out there that we don't know about. And there's lots and lots of providers that don't understand they've got a heat network. As I was saying earlier, I've been to lots of social housing conferences and I talk about heat networks and I talk about the approach that we're taking. And lots of my peers say to me, I've got no heat networks. I was like, well, do you sell heating service charge? Yes. I was like, you've got a heat network. And there's just it's a lack of understanding. Lack of understanding all around the country in multiple towns and cities where there's these small scale heat networks with like 10 or 40 or 50 people connected, they're still going to have to comply. And there's the assumption I don't need to do that. I was like, you absolutely do need to do that. So I think it's a more concentrated problem in London, but there's lots of networks that absolutely nobody is aware of.
Yeah, I'd agree with Dan. I had a couple of days up in Manchester this week, and there's lots of networks up there, really, again, that people often don't realise they've got. So there's a lot out there, without doubt.
Okay, so back on KPIs, etc. Are these more, quantitative requirements? As you talked about 200 watts per dwelling, but is there more other kind of KPIs as well in terms of, response to consumers, transparency of data? What's the kind of balance between technical and maybe non-technical?
Yeah, there's a good balance really between the obvious performance from data that's coming through from the meters and other sensors on the system. But a lot, particularly with existing, really is about getting your O&M practices correct. It's about getting your records in place, recording things, making sure your water treatment's up to spec, making sure you're doing inspections and that type of thing on a regular basis. And eventually, when you get to the point where you're looking to become a proper certified network for further down the milestones, then you've got to have at least 6 months worth of data for your O&M practices and 3 months worth of data for your metering and monitoring in place, basically. So it gives you an idea of the where the emphasis is initially, because as I mentioned, so many of the problems at the moment is about reliability in networks, and it's really about trying to improve that rapidly to get that consumer confidence back up.
That's probably an important point as well. It's not just about complying with the regulation to begin with. It's then an ongoing and forever thing for the life of these networks.
And as you look at it, it's quite light touch. I mean, regulation consumer protection comes into effect very shortly, and it's very, very light touch. But as you progress through the milestones, it becomes more and more rigorous or onerous, depending on which way you want to look at it, and more reporting requirements. One of the big KPIs is AMR data and your uptimes, and that's specifically designed to protect customers. Are we actually getting meter reads? Can we report on the consumption? What's your block level meter look like? What's the whole system efficiency look like? You've got to start at that meter points, otherwise you can't really report on any of the KPIs. And getting that sorted for your operators is the one thing that we as an operator, we've concentrated on first. How do we reach milestone 2 and how do we reach milestone 3B with the metering requirements? And we've started that process now. Because certainly, at some point there's going to be a shortage of materials, there'll be a shortage in labour. Who's going to deliver this? Inevitably, costs will increase because it's a supply and demand market.
Okay, maybe let's define these milestones in a bit more detail, just so from everyone's understanding. So, if we take a new build a new build heat network, for example, so design stage, there'll be a milestone. You can't proceed until that's been signed off, and that needs to be an independent.
It's slightly different with new build pathway. It's more, I would call it a quality gate, really. So it follows the stages or the phases really that were set out in CIPSE CP1. So you've got your feasibility, design, construction, operation phases. But at the end of each of those phases, you've got this quality gate where an independent assessor is looking at what you've done. So, if you're doing a feasibility from the start, then once you've start to submit that evidence, the assessor will start to look through it and see what you've done. Is it going to be a viable network, etc. The whole, the whole idea with this is that it's going to be a preventative scheme, so that you cannot get to the end of it and you've got a heat network that is essentially just not fit for purpose. It's got to be, and I think that's a big part of the lessons learned that's been going on with heat networks. If you go right back, to CIPSE CP1, it was updated 2020. There's a lot of learning, and we, the whole thing has happened again with the new standard TS1. A huge amount of learning has gone on, and it's incorporated in there. And so we must start to build heat networks in the right way. So the similar thing goes on at design. Once you've done your design, etc., again, is checked by an independent assessor, and you wouldn't move on until they're happy with what's in there. And I think there probably is a fair bit more work that's got to be done in terms of evidence, etc., at each stage. And there's a lot of different assessments of those kind of the evidence you're putting through, because HNTAS is very much built around how do we eradicate the key failures. So a lot of effort has been put into looking at how the key failures occur on heat networks. When do they occur? What stage do they occur, and how do you eliminate that? And so that's where the higher levels of evidence and things like that will be looked at, is those key failures. So they're the two kind of areas that will affect immediately. And then as you get into the construction phase, you're into more kind of validation on site then, in terms of making sure that there'll be things like spot checks on pipe work, insulation, that type of thing. And then ultimately you get to a stage where you've got acceptance testing going on, typically in apartments, maybe looking at how the system is performing. Is it performing to design, how you expect, etc. And so you get through that phase, another quality gate, and it's at that point that you get your first certificate, which could be looked on really as that's your initial license to supply heat. But it doesn't end there, because there's a kind of bedding in period, if you like, for 2 years, where you're submitting data, you're submitting all your KPIs and things. And if the assessor's happy, ultimately after those 2 years, then you get your second certificate, and you're a fully fledged, certificated heat network. But as Dan was saying, it doesn't even end there, because there is, if you like, lifetime monitoring of these KPIs going on. And, Ofgem has the powers there. If it feels that things are not performing as they should be, it has the powers to step in and ultimately take those licenses away, if necessary, from an operator. So
just to add to the new build section, obviously, we're a major developer. We partner with national house builders all the time to build estates and heat networks, but we are concerned with the skill level within those particular developers and being able to attain the license sign-offs and the milestones. If a new build development is held up, there's a significant cost to the developer, to the landlord, the housing provider. We've got hundreds of millions of pounds wrapped up in land and building and liabilities, and if there's any delay in the sale, that just increases the interest that we've got to pay. It's a significant, massive impact to the whole construction industry. And I know some of our peers have got huge concerns about it. So it's we need to ensure that not just the contractors, but the developers and the main contract builders understand that they're actually going to be partially responsible for this.
So you see this kind of requirements and compliance, even though it's a regulation, it's going to fall more into the employee's requirements and the contract documents of
It's going to
new
have
build.
to be, because we tend to point design and
Yeah.
build contracts, so it's going to have to fall. It's going to have to form part of those contracts. You can't get PC unless you've got your final certificates. If we haven't got PC, we can't sell anything. So it has a massive ongoing impact of what can be delivered in the future.
And, you mentioned earlier about previous regulations not having teeth. Is that the exact teeth, particularly on new build, that residents won't be able to move in and occupy those dwellings if you don't have this regulation sign-off?
Yeah, definitely. And as Dan said, there's a huge concern, really. I think it's one of the areas where there has been big concern because the industry's just not used to having a real kind of hard stop, pass-fail. It's more used to dealing with if there's issues that are identified, then we kind of work through them, and there's a period of time. But this, as it is at the minute, at least, and this is one of the key areas that I think that will be interesting to see what comes back on the consultation really here, because it's definitely been voiced that is a key area of concern currently.
The structure of HNTAS is very similar to the Building Safety Act. You've got gateways, you've got independent assessors, you've got designated responsible parties. Do you think that was in the author's mindset when they were kind of developing this? And, what lessons do you think we could take from the Building Safety Act and the way that's been implemented, and, some of the issues around there that should be kind of considered?
Consideration should be given to how much resource the regulators actually got. Gateway forms of the building safety regulator, as far as we're concerned, as a landlord, take far too long. And if we have those kind of delays, getting sign off for licensing or milestones, it's going to drive the industry away from heat networks. There's already talk of the industry looking at alternative measures to try and get away from this. If we make it too onerous, too cost effective, too long, eventually the industry will have to push back, because there's some things will just be undeliverable. And I really don't want it to get to that point, but it's really difficult to see some people not making that decision to walk away from district heating.
Yeah, it's been a massive gamble, I think, right from the start in some respects, that if you get this wrong, you could shut the industry down. You really could. It's got to be proportional. That was always one of the key core principles of the scheme, as it were. It's got to be workable. And if it doesn't work for an industry, then there's always that risk. I'm hopeful that things will develop in the right way. I think the DESNES need this to work. It's got to work in some form, and I think it's been interesting really, because they've done some of the pilot schemes at the moment. I think there was 12 heat networks that took part in that, and some of the findings from the pilot schemes are quite interesting really, because I think a lot of the contractors went in there quite confident about what they were going to be able to do, and there was a lot came to light really as they went through. So the one good thing maybe around this is the mechanism in terms of feedback into this process, and making sure that there is an adaptability possible here if things are just not working. It could be tweaked fairly easily, I think.
So really interesting conversation, so much kind of knowledge passed on there. So Daniel, Peter, thank you so much for coming in and talking to us.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's been good.
Thank you for listening to our Hard Hats and Hot Topics podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to follow us on your preferred podcast platform, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and stay connected with us on LinkedIn and Instagram for all the latest news and events.